Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and anybody that's tuning in and listening, I'm sure there's so many other news items and things that people will be tuning in for. However, if those that are tuning in now, we've got a great guest, and it's one of the gentlemen that's always able to speak about subject matter and has got great insight into the business as well as an openness with his opinion. His name's Glyn Hughes, and he is the global head of cargo for IATA. So, Glyn, thank you very, very much for coming on, and good morning.
Good morning, Chris, and thank you very much. It's a pleasure despite the circumstances. Thank you very much for giving airtime to such an important topic at this very critical time for the industry.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, somber times, but please God, things will improve. Now, Glyn, normally I'd be asking you a lot about yourself and the person behind the position. That's how the series started. But obviously, there's more topical things to be discussing. And what I'd like to start with is how has it affected IATA?
Well, as you can imagine, IATA being a trade association, it's been quite critical for our members. With the proliferation of travel restrictions being put in place, with the number of states introducing quarantine conditions, that travel has been severely clamped down as a way of trying to control the spread of COVID-19. So that's on one side. We've seen a dramatic reduction. In fact, I think the latest numbers shows that flight cancellations is over 1 million flight cancellations now, with many airlines withdrawing almost their entire passenger services or service. However, on the other side, we need to look at the cargo side. It's actually been on the front line of the fight against COVID-19 by flying around medical equipment, aids. You think about masks, you think about equipment to help build respirators around the world, etc. So the air cargo industry has really rallied, as you would imagine, during this time of crisis. And there's been some quite innovative approaches that a number of carriers have taken. So as a trade association, our role has very much changed as well, reacting to this. We've been working with states to try and get cargo exempt from travel restrictions that are being implemented. We've helped on the ground with trying to make sure that there are adequate cleaning facilities so that any crew that are actually operating on the cargo services can manage to operate in the safest and most clean environment possible, because we've got to protect people at the end of the day.
100%, Glyn, 100%. And the point you touched on there, for everybody who's now, and most of the world now are either in lockdown, clamped down, whatever term that people want to use, that gives a sort of a peculiar feeling when somebody says we're in lockdown. But the whole world is becoming accustomed to certain things. So a term that I'm using now, probably more than I ever even thought, is, there's going to be a new normal. Nobody's yesterdays are going to be the same. And it's a little bit like some of those programs that used to be on years ago where they used to look back at time and they used to call it all our yesterdays. Well, we're a generation now that's definitely going to be looking and reflecting on that term. But this new normal is a chance now for everybody and every company, every individual, every political party, every government, every regulatory body to do things differently that they weren't doing before.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think, again, if you look at almost every aspect of society, not just related to our industry, but how we all work, IATA has had part of what you were saying, lockdown for the last several weeks. We've all been teleworking, so it's created a new way of working. When you have teams that are not just located geographically diverse, but in different time zones, and now where you've got everybody individually at home, we've been having to employ new techniques to stay connected as a team, to work collaboratively on programs, and also trying to maintain that balance between work and private life, because that's so critically important as well for our mental and physical well-being as individuals. So I totally agree with you that society is going to change going forward as a result of this. This may be a sad health scenario, but it's actually turning into a major economic one, and it will actually ultimately result in a significant society change as well. I totally agree with you there, Chris.
Yeah, I heard something yesterday from a relatively new CEO of an airline, and his communication to his entire workforce and team was so different from anything that I've seen or heard of. He was talking about everybody loves to travel, and how this has put a restriction now on travel and learning in the old sense. But he was saying that if you look at it and you travel around your home more, you will see things you've never seen before. And if you travel into your mind and learn more, you'll be able to educate yourself better. And if you travel into the eyes and the minds of your children, you'll understand them better and you'll have a better relationship with them. And if you travel into the world of your partner, and whether it's a wife or a husband or whatever relationship is out there, you appreciate what people are doing more. And so what he was saying is, your own personal life now is the world that you can travel in unlimited, and you're not restricted in any way or form. And now's the chance to reflect and go back to the real good values and just learn to be with each other and learn to love each other and learn to do things in a much nicer and pleasant way. And I just thought that was so nice. And then, I think he ended with something along the lines of, until the traditional borders open again, we wish you safe and happy travels. And I just thought it was almost poetic. And I think now, if people start to do things differently, and like you said, now you've almost been forced into adapting new technology and new ways of communicating. Whereas in the old days, you had people, but will they really work from home, and will they be disciplined, and will they do this, and will they do that? I think perhaps in the future now there will be a positive reception to more work from home, which will actually make things more productive. It will save people the commutes, and some people's commutes are incredible because of property values and location. And I think people will be able to spend more time with their family and more time catching up on life and enjoying life. And in turn, that will reflect in the way they perform at work. So I think there's a good sign there with technology. It'll also reduce the amount of office space and cost of offices in the future. So I see that as a real upside.
And I think you're right. And I think people are realizing what you actually can do. Even if you look at some of the TV broadcasters who have actually banned from going to the stock exchange, for example. So, in this day and age, with the way that technology has developed, not just for our industry, but other industries as well, is that it will change the way we work, but we still do need to make sure that we don't lose that human touch, because particularly in our industry, which is at the end of the day, it's about people using technology and people connecting people and things to each other. So I think you're right that we will hopefully get a new appreciation for things we've perhaps taken for granted in the past. But it's also important to make sure that we don't then fall into new areas of social isolation when this thing ultimately ends. And it will end.
Yeah.
This is
exactly. Exactly, Glyn. Yeah. I agree with you there. And I was also talking to somebody about this, and I told them, I said, look, if you use your laptop or your computer or your phone, everybody is so reliant on it, and that's the technology part. But the one thing you can't do is it can't run and run and run without being plugged in. And the plug-in for the power is what you're saying, is that you can't have one without the other. You need to plug into the human interface side to make sure that people actually appreciate it and see the value of how you can endorse what you can do remotely and get recognition, get collaboration, get cooperation, etc. when you do plug into the human interface side.
Absolutely, yeah, and we have to remember that the human race is a social group, and that we are community based by origins, as it were, and that we need to continue to come together, but perhaps appreciate that time more when we come together, because we've been forced apart as we are now. So you're absolutely right. We've got a different world that we have ahead of us.
Yeah. Now I've got a question for you, Glyn. Now, I mean, we've known each other years, okay. And one of the things, and I've been on panels and I'm on committees, and I'm a big supporter of standards and compliance and verification. But I'm also very frustrated at areas that just do enough to get across that line of standards so that they can participate in that competitive market or that particular field. And I feel now is the time to be tougher and to be more stringent and to raise the bar of those particular standards. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think, again, we have to look at particularly from an air cargo perspective, we're all here collectively to serve the industry, and that industry is really there about providing global connectivity, transportation solutions for the shipping and the consumer markets. And as their needs evolve, you're absolutely right. We can't rely back on standards that are 20, 30, 40 years old because, as you started off in your intro, the world today is a different world from last month, let alone last decade, and let alone last century. So the same is true for the industry standards. Industry standards at a, I don't want to be unkind, but at a default base level were critical when the industry was fledgling, when it was just starting to get its wings, as it were, and starting to globally connect, starting to globally interline, and starting to understand what aviation and air cargo in particular was about. Now we're much more about specialization. We're much more about time critical, handling specifics, particularly when you're talking about some of the sensitive and very relevant right now, the very time and temperature sensitive commodities such as the pharmaceuticals that are being flown around the world. And ultimately, again, we have to look, and there will be vaccines ultimately available and treatment programs for this particular coronavirus, and air cargo will be front and center. So it's critical that the next generation of standards, and you're absolutely spot on, Chris, have to be about excellence. They have to be agile. They also have to be quickly established. And I think one other thing that you'll see going forward, and this is how we are changing as well as an organization, is I think we have to recognize those who want to run fastest and make sure that we can actually support them in the creation of industry standards at the pace necessary for the shipping and community that needs them now, whilst also at the same time helping those who are perhaps a little bit slower and perhaps have slightly different, maybe slightly less sophisticated needs, and they're in a different part of the journey. But also we need to make sure that they have standards that are relevant for them as well. So I think you might see going forward multi-tiering of industry standards based on these differing requirements and demands from different sectors of the industry.
Yeah, Glyn, that's really good. And there's a couple of things there that you touched on. Now, I've been at several meetings, and I'm not just referring to IATA and some of the conferences, and it would appear that there's so much administration and bureaucracy and focus on things that are recommended rather than areas that are critical or important. And I think moving forward, we've got to be so focused now on releasing some of that weight in everybody's rucksacks. And if you keep taking extra rocks and putting them in your own life's rucksacks and taking other people's problems and other people's shortfalls, it just wears you down and it brings you down. And at the end of the day, whether it's the return to sport, whether it's just people finding vaccines, everybody wants to be a winner and everybody admires winners. And this business about life being about participating instead of achieving is not the best way forward, in my opinion. And I'm sorry, just in my opinion. So I would like to see a real shedding of that administration and bureaucracy and time wasting, time consuming activities that are all about recommendations that take so many people to make a damn decision. And I think now we've got to streamline and focus on the critical parts very, very quickly. And then once we get them, we look at the important before we start looking at recommended items. Now, you said about multi-tiering. I think that makes sense. But I think the multi-tiering should also be time related, because people sometimes get complacent in being in the second division or the third division or just surviving because they know they're not going to get promoted. And I think it's a must that any multi-tiering has to be time definite, and those particular organisations or those countries or those governments, etc., they should be positively influenced to get the SME or the expert support to get them into the minimum requirements within a defined period of time. Now that covers a multitude of sins, from climate change to basic health issues, basic safety guidelines. And you look at the trade wars that were going on before all of this happened, and you look at the difference. I watched the program about chickens and chickens being dipped in I can't remember what it was, but some chemical mix or whatever, and how chickens are bred and the different standards of beef and everything else. I think there has to be a lot more transparency on how mass production is being managed and is being conducted for the good of people, able to then make a decision as to whether or not they should spend 1 unit or 1.25 of a unit. And I know that some organisations are able to capitalise on the fact that people sometimes don't have enough funds to go to that extra level of safety or security. But I think that's where we need to do something.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest. I think there's some of that I would agree with you wholeheartedly. I think when it comes to things like safety and security, there can't be multi-tiering. Safety and security, you've got to have the highest standards possible because those are critical. You know, you wouldn't drive a car if somebody said, oh, this car is very cheap, but it doesn't have any brakes in it. But you've got an engine, you've got an accelerator, but we've taken the cost out, so there's no brakes. Nobody would drive that car.
No, 100%, Glyn. Sorry to interrupt you there, 100%. But what I'm talking about now is if the vehicle isn't being MOT'd on a regular basis or it isn't having preventive maintenance.
Yeah, but I would also put that under that absolute minimum level. I think, you know, when you look at our industry, for example, you've got the IATA safety audit, which is an absolute, it's a minimum standard for IATA membership, which is also enshrined in a lot of state-based AOC requirements. And that is a minimum, which is in fact a high level of safety. When it comes to aircraft and equipment, you're absolutely right. People cannot cut corners when it comes to things like maintenance, scheduling, and servicing and operating, safe procedures with regards to adherence to crew operating hours and regular maintenance checks, etc. So from an infrastructure perspective, the industry, any industry, is always going to be judged by the lowest common denominator, the weakest link. And from aviation's perspective, everything, whether it comes, is about public confidence in the aviation industry. Where I was talking about multi-tiering is really coming down to, let's say, very specific of handling of commodities and products. Some airlines are really specializing in time and temperature, cold chain environments. They have they've invested and they've employed at the highest standards possible. Whereas other carriers, forwarders, ground handlers, truckers, etc., their niche is just moving boxes with not necessarily perishable or time-sensitive product in it. Others' niche is now moving e-commerce, which is very much about time and transparency. That's where I think the multi-tiering of standards comes in. But to your point, I wholeheartedly agree. Safety and security could never and should never be multi-tiered. They need to be at the highest level possible to get the industries. Basically, it's the license to operate.
And yeah, I totally agree, Glyn. And where I was actually coming from is if there are tighter standards across multi products, it might differentiate or divert some of the trade lanes that have been and were common. So, you know, if you look at the amount of business coming from China, and 8 out of 10 of the top ports are in China globally. So if you look at the amount of business and the reliance on one particular region, you now look at the paracetamol and pharmaceuticals coming from India. There and then you look at each country's capability to produce vaccines themselves. There's so much reliance on possibly too few areas or too few sources, and I think I personally think that needs to be rebalanced as we move forward, and there needs to be a lot more self-sufficiency, which would affect the trade lanes and the commodity movements as we've known them in the past. But it comes at a price.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Chris, as you're also, I think, highlighting one of those evolutionary changes that will result from what we're currently going through. It actually, in my view, started a little bit last year when they had the trade wars. There were a number of manufacturers who were saying, well, you factor in an extra 25% tariff on top of what's being produced in a certain country around the world, it now starts to call into question the economics of producing there. So we did see last year quite a bit of electronics moving towards Vietnam and other parts of the world. You know, Turkey was having some growth, and as was Malaysia. So I think you will find, to your point, all manufacturers around the world will start looking at diversification of production to avoid perhaps over-reliance, because you can never foresee. People thought they could never foresee. I think people will now start to foresee risk management, which means blockages of supply chain.
Yeah.
And if you recall, you're a young man, but you can remember the volcano when that closed off the North Atlantic airspace. Production plants in the US, the BMW, were closed down for a week because they couldn't get the components coming in from Germany. So air cargo supply chains are mostly valued when they're not there.
Yeah.
That's when people tend to appreciate them. And I think that is something where when we come through this, I think you'll find that there will be a lot of manufacturers around the world that will saying is that, well, global supply chains and global connectivity and value chains are very economic, but there are risks associated with those if there are production blockages, if there are reduction, as it were, in manpower that can't even go to the plant. So again, I think you're right that the world as we see it in the next few years will probably go through another change of perhaps more global manufacturing, less reliance on certain markets. But I think at the end of the day, we as consumers still tend to make purchasing decisions based on our wallets. And at the end of the day, that's what manufacturers are actually probably being driven by, which is what will the consumer spend. So it's a balance between all of these factors.
Yeah, and it's going to be an interesting change if there is a change, because I'm looking back now and everybody says, even my kids, Dad, what you keep hold of that jacket for or that coat? And I'll say, because I like it. And they say, yeah, get yourself a new one, and this sort of throwaway society and the waste and and then the lower cost and the pressure on cost and the protection of people who are producing those commodities. That's all got to be part of a new normal as we move forward now, because if we don't learn the lessons, things will happen again. And I think all C-suite groups are going to be spending an awful lot more time reflecting and appreciating risk management, business continuity and contingency and emergency response, so that they're more prepared. I also think, Glyn, that this particular terrible situation we're all in, there's going to be a sort of a ramp up and then a contraction phase that's going to happen, and I think companies and people working for companies that are going to be affected more than others, they're going to have to appreciate that it's almost like a pull-push principle, that as things get under a little bit more control, and whether it's climatically influenced or just containment, people will have to ramp up. And then when it comes to winter again or another bout until vaccines are in place, there's going to have to be another controlled contraction to prevent things. Now, all of that is going to affect passenger travel hugely.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, again, I don't disagree with you one iota there, Chris. I think you're spot on with that.
And if it is going to affect it dramatically, one of the things that obviously is a natural effect is there's going to have to be a reflection on pricing and some of the standards, and we come back to standards again now, Glyn, and the pressures with time and the pressures on cost. The whole process sometimes gets overlooked, and I think the sort of the barometer or the temperature gauge of what's correct and what's best practice, a lot of that stands with organisations like your own. And you spoke about IOSA, and I've been through IOSA audits with 1 to 5 carriers. And, I think it's a fantastic platform. It's a necessity. But where I've always been a little bit skeptical is the quality and the depth of the audits themselves. And people have in the past spent more time worrying about findings rather than appreciating findings, because that's what helps you improve.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, findings is the way we improve. It's highlighting those. And I think one of the things, though, that it is a solid testament to the objective of IOSA, which obviously is a safe industry, is the record of aviation in the last few years in terms of safety improvements around the world.
Yes, you're right.
And And I think that aviation is not, I think we know aviation is still the safest mass form of transportation in terms of protecting human lives. And it has to be recognized, though, that when things go wrong, they go wrong in a big way. And our role, of course, as an industry is to learn from that, continually improve the safety assessments and how aircraft are certified and how aircraft are manufactured and how airlines operate them and the maintenance programs and training and procedures both on the ground and in the air. And it is an industry that's got a proud history of 100 and something odd years now, and it continually learns, and it will continually learn because, as we said before, is that safety and security of passengers and employees and people on the ground and in society is the number one priority for this industry.
Yeah, no, you're right, Glyn, and it's always good to emphasise that because it's an industry that people take lessons from, and like you said, the amount of movement, the amount of people, the amount of cargo, and to do so in such an efficient and safe way is exceptional, and it's what keeps the world going as well, which we have to remember.
Exactly, and just on that, Chris, just let me say, whilst we're on the safety side, of course, one of the challenges that we continue to tackle, and we've been tackling quite extensively as an industry over the last couple of years, is the misdeclared dangerous goods, in particular lithium batteries.
Yep.
And in particular, those misdeclarations quite often relate to counterfeit and substandard manufactured batteries. And so part of our role as a trade association here is to reach out to as many governments as we can around the world and urge them to work with us about stamping this out at point of production. The supply chain and ultimately the consumers are being put at risk because countries are allowing these things, and I don't say allow in the sense that they are encouraging it or endorsing it, but things are being manufactured, counterfeit things are being manufactured, and we're not talking like a counterfeit Louis Vuitton handbag or a Guess t-shirt, etc. Those are intellectual property counterfeits, which are the economic problem with that. But we're talking about things that put people's lives at risk. And this is where we would continue to urge states around the world to work with us on identifying production points of lithium batteries that are counterfeit and not compliant, and the same with pharmaceuticals that are counterfeit and not compliant, and eradicate those.
100%, Glyn. And I think that's also now where organisations like yourselves and as many others as possible across industry, they've got to come up now with country and government solidarity programs to stop all this now, because there should be zero tolerance for all these things that were acceptable in all our yesterdays. And in the new normal should not be allowed. And especially, any of us that have had a lot of experience, lithium battery, also in e-commerce, it's just unacceptable. Now, I know that you're working on setting common standards. So you've got mail, you've got e-commerce, you've got cargo. It's an area that needs to be definitely consolidated, Glyn, so that there's one set of rules for everybody.
Yeah, agreed. And we're very pleased here to be working with all of the major e-commerce platforms. And it starts with an education of what the problem is, and then it opens very quickly into a very productive dialogue as to how they can perhaps onboard their e-tailers in a more educational process, how they can perhaps build in, some of the algorithms. These guys have tremendous technology and tremendous data on their platform activity, and how they can use that to perhaps identify when there are some e-tailers. And we had a recent example, again, where somebody is selling a battery online, very powerful, let's say model toy battery, far too powerful to go on board a passenger aircraft. And yet they put wrong and basically counterfeit labels on it to indicate that the power rating is actually lower than the threshold, so it can be moved via air. Now, what this tells us two things is, number one, these people know the regulations, and that makes it worse. You can't claim naivety or ignorance here. They know the regulations because they're putting in measures to actually circumvent them. And for those scenarios, we believe, and ultimately custodial sentences or significant penalties is the only way to demonstrate to others that type of behavior, i.e. putting people's lives at risk, will not be tolerated.
100%, Glyn. There should be zero tolerance, and every single government should sign up should sign up and stop all this happening. And if everybody was together and not so open to allow, for whatever reason, these things to continue, it would be a better place. And that's what it's all about now in the future. It's about making this small planet, this very, very valuable planet, a much better place by focusing on the critical items and the important, and not all these recommendations and discussions and debates. I think the time now is, for people who can make quick collaborative decisions that are critically effective and are very important for everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah, decisive action. Fully agree with you, Chris.
Right, we're nearly coming to the end, Glyn. How's your team? How are they coping with everything? And because there is this issue, how people are going to respond when things start to come back. Because if people think it's going to be the return of what it was, the education, like you said, and the awareness, and some of the programs that I think are going to need to be made to make people realise and understand why certain things are going to have to change and change very quickly in the future. I think that's part of that's part of what we need to do differently as well. And even from IATA's perspective, making a few documentaries, or instead of saving our planet with the Silver Maestro, maybe we should hook him across and get him to do something on the the values of doing things correctly and what can go wrong, and why you shouldn't always buy cheap.
Yeah, I think and you asked about the cargo team, and I appreciate that, because I have to be honest, Chris, I'm privileged to be working with such a tremendous group of professionals, and what we've all been experiencing in these last 6 weeks has just showed the value of them as a group, and as is the same with the rest of the air cargo industry. We have the ability to work from home to effectively socially isolate and therefore protect ourselves, but the brave men and women who are working in the logistics industry, whether or not it's the forwarders, the truckers, the ground handlers, the flight crews, everybody else associated with supply chain, they're out there on the front line every day, the same as the medical staff around the world, making sure that those critical and urgent medical supplies are moving. And I think we'll owe them a huge debt of gratitude and take our hat off to them for effectively putting altruistically the value of society above their own safety in some cases. And I'm very pleased that my cargo team are working tirelessly. We are home working, as we've mentioned, but they are working wherever we can to make sure that the cargo can flow as it is necessarily needs to move those goods around the world. We're working with carriers, as you mentioned, when they are putting passenger flights on for cargo-only operations. There's a lot of guidance that some of those carriers need, and we've got our experts to help them through that process, working with states to making sure that they can put adequate procedures in place to make sure that the cargo is not blocked at borders. So we're working with the WCO, we work extensively with ICAO, with our partners. Our TACT team in Amsterdam are putting together, well, in fact, they've put together some tremendous tools, which then makes it available for the world to see what carrier operations are still operating and where they've been implementing new solutions or new operations. So there's just so much that we're currently doing, lobbying to get flights operating, slot restrictions moved. As you know, IATA is also calling upon states around the world to actually support aviation at this critical time.
Yeah.
And of course, when we get through this, we will be doing exactly as you were saying, which is calling upon the global economies of this world to put measures in place to help those individuals, help those states, and help those businesses that may not make it through this current time frame. So I think we have a collective responsibility as well to see how we can help those who are less fortunate and who perhaps have suffered from a health-wise situation as well as from an economic situation.
100%, Glyn. And the fact that you've spoken about everybody on the front line and especially those in the health business and looking after people and putting themselves in front, a huge amount of recognition and respect needs to be done during this terrible time and most definitely after it, because the health heroes are people that the amount of stories that you hear, and I've got a guy who does some work with me, and his wife works in the intensive care unit in the local hospital, And because they were running low on equipment, she was spending 6 continuous hours because they didn't have enough equipment to take off and then re-equip. I mean, it's phenomenal what they do. And yet every morning she's up, she's out, she does a long shift. Those people, they really, really, really need to be appreciated more. And if anybody deserves, extra reward or remuneration after all of this, it's that particular sector.
Yeah, totally agree. Well said.
And for yourself, my friends, and I know it's very easy to ask questions and to say why and everything, but what you're doing and what your team are doing, and myself and Salem, we spent a day in Geneva with 6 of your finest, and we had a very, 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 very positive time there. You could see how everybody was full of care for the industry and also for everybody else. And without everything that you do, no matter what types of debates or questions, etc., things would be far, far, far worse, Glyn. So you're doing a great job, you and the team. It's really appreciated. And the only thing that I would always have to say, though, is, less talk, more action. And those people that are dragging you down with administration and recommendations, cast them aside quickly. And start focusing on the critical actions and making those decisions very quickly. But you do it very well,
yeah, we do.
And it's greatly appreciated.
All right, thanks, Chris. I much appreciate that, and thank you and to all of your listeners.
Yeah, and to yourself.
And am I the only guest you've ever had on that you consider not pretty enough to show on video, so it's just a static picture of me?
No, mate. We can touch that one up, Glyn, but don't worry, we'll have you back. We'll have you back, please God, and it will be an absolute pleasure. And let's hope it's in much, much, much finer times with, like I said, new normals being put into place and people appreciating each other a lot more than they did before.
All right, Chris, well said again. And I wish you and all your listeners safe isolation, as it were, and health and happiness to friends, colleagues and loved ones.
Exactly, Lynn. And to you and all your teams and your family and everybody, stay safe, look after each other, and try and put a smile on everybody's face as many times as you can in the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, will do.
All the best, Glyn. Thank you.
All right. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.